Again, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. This is such a critical issue, and we are very grateful that you've taken the time on hopefully what is a gorgeous Friday holiday weekend. But the reason we want to do this was yesterday the Alliance for Justice put out a comprehensive, over 50-page report reviewing Judge Gorsuch's record in numerous areas, from how he'd affect workers, how he'd affect women, how he'd affect everyday Americans. And we reached one very clear conclusion, that it is hard to overstate the damage that Judge Gorsuch would do if he's confirmed to the United States Supreme Court. In countless areas of the law, Judge Gorsuch regularly sides with the powerful, with corporations, with bosses, over everyday Americans. We're going to open up Facebook to your questions, but I just want to cover 3 or 4 areas which epitomize Judge Gorsuch's record, and then turn it over to my colleague Lisa. First, Judge Gorsuch makes clear his hostility towards the advancement of legal and social progress. This country has made enormous progress over the last century, much of it through the courts, but also through Congress, in protecting the American people and expanding critical rights. Judge Gorsuch, both before and after he became a judge, has repeatedly questioned the ability of the Constitution, Congress, and federal agencies to enforce critical protections, from the rights to marry, to reproductive rights, to rights for workers who just want a safe place to work. Second, Judge Gorsuch has repeatedly downplayed abuses of constitutional rights by government. This is epitomized by a case out of Utah where the Republican governor tried to unilaterally defund Planned Parenthood, when the rest of the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals said such action would be unconstitutional. Judge Gorsuch took extraordinary steps in an attempt to uphold that Republican governor's brazen effort to deny women access to critical health care. Third, Judge Gorsuch repeatedly favors corporate interests in countless areas, whether workers' rights, anti-discrimination law, or consumer rights. Judge Gorsuch repeatedly sides with corporations. And third, he has said he is skeptical of the role of the federal government in protecting clean air and water, safe food and medicine, or labor rights, equal protection, women's health care. What Neil Gorsuch wants is to return this country to pre-New Deal days, where the federal government has a minimal role. I just want to emphasize one case which I think epitomizes Neil Gorsuch's record. That's the case of Alphonse Madden, a truck driver who was driving through the middle of the Midwest in Illinois in the middle of winter. His truck broke down and he lost heat in his truck. He stayed in that truck for hours waiting for a repair car, freezing. At some point, he can't feel his feet. His torso is numb. He has trouble breathing. He makes the decision which any one of us would have made, that instead of waiting indefinitely for a repair truck, he drove away, leaving his trailer to stay warm. That employer fired that truck driver. And Mr. Madden did what all of us would do. He sought recourse in the federal courts and federal government. And the Department of Labor said, yes, you acted reasonably and it was improper for you to be fired. 2 judges on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals agreed that in that circumstance, to save his own life, of course Alphonse Madden did the right thing, and he should not have had to choose between his health and his job. What does Neil Gorsuch say? He said, 1, the Department of Labor was wrong in protecting Alphonse Madden. And 2, Alphonse Madden had a choice. He could have stayed in his freezing truck until a repair truck came. This is not somebody who should be on the Supreme Court of the United States. This is not somebody who will advance the rights and protections of all Americans. This is an individual who is looking out for the powerful and for corporations. We encourage you to read our 50-page report in areas from women's rights to workers' rights to disabilities to persons with disabilities. He is on the wrong side of our Constitution, our laws, and our values. And we hope that the senators will reject his confirmation. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague Lisa, who did so much of this research and reviewed so many of Judge Gorsuch's writings and can further demonstrate how out of touch he is with the American people.
Thanks, Dan, and thank you to everybody who's joining us today. I hope that we'll be able to provide you with a little bit of information about Neil Gorsuch to help the American people make a decision about whether or not Neil Gorsuch would be an appropriate choice for the next Supreme Court justice. One area that Dan touched on a little bit that I'd like to highlight is Judge Gorsuch's record on women's rights and access to reproductive health care. As a Supreme Court justice, Judge Gorsuch would have the opportunity to shape the lives and futures of women for generations to come. As we've seen, the Supreme Court has taken actions that have limited female workers' ability to get equal pay for equal work. They've stripped the rights of women to be able to access reproductive health care services. And based on our review of Judge Gorsuch's record, we believe that he would systematically vote to strip the hard-won advancements that have been made over the last century in women's rights and access to reproductive health care. Dan talked a little bit about one of the cases that sort of demonstrate Judge Gorsuch's approach in the Planned Parenthood of Utah case, where he broke from a majority of his colleagues in order to make a point that he thought that it was appropriate under the Constitution for the governor of Utah to unilaterally strip funding. I think there are two other cases that sort of demonstrate Judge Gorsuch's hostility to women's rights, and those cases are the original Hobby Lobby case, where Judge Gorsuch joined the majority in holding that corporations are people and they have the ability to express religious beliefs that can prevent women from having easy access to reproductive health care services and contraceptive health care in particular. When the government made an accommodation for those organizations so that all they had to do was sign a form in order to pass along the responsibility for providing contraceptive health care to women, Judge Gorsuch said that the signing of that form burdened the free exercise of religion for those corporations and organizations. That was a decision that was not joined by a majority of his colleagues and sort of speaks to how far outside of the sort of accepted standards Judge Gorsuch really is on women's rights. And then I think the other sort of area where Judge Gorsuch has displayed a hostility to women's rights is in the area of workers, and Dan talked a little bit about that. But there are several cases, if you read through his record, that demonstrate that Judge Gorsuch doesn't understand the difficulties that many women face in the workplace, the discrimination that happens so often. And when women come forward with claims of discrimination, Judge Gorsuch has turned a blind eye, whether that was to a woman who was discriminated against at UPS, where she was forced to attend additional meetings, even though she was beating all of her sales goals and regularly outperforming her male colleagues. Judge Gorsuch departed from a majority of his colleagues and said, that question doesn't need to go to a jury. I can say right now that she was not discriminated against. So those are just a few examples of the way that Judge Gorsuch has treated women's rights, and we're confident that as a Supreme Court justice, he would continue his hostility to women's rights and take us back to a time before women had full rights under the Constitution.
And we have some questions. What should ordinary citizens do to oppose this nomination?
Thank you for the question. I think that's a perfect question. So the confirmation process, we are making clear, and I think all Americans need to make clear to their senators, that this is not a normal confirmation. That President Trump has repeatedly attacked the independence of the judiciary, the integrity of the judiciary, and given Neil Gorsuch's record, the Senate needs to provide heightened scrutiny. We encourage all people to learn about Neil Gorsuch's record and make clear to their senators Number one, that he is not somebody who should serve on the Supreme Court. And number two, that consistent with past nominations, the next person on the Supreme Court should enjoy broad bipartisan support and be somebody who shares the values of the American people. Ask your senators to use whatever tools are available under the Senate to make sure that Neil Gorsuch is not confirmed to the Supreme Court.
We have another question. What will Gorsuch's nomination mean for me as a woman? And Lisa, I believe you talked somewhat about the effect on women's rights, but if you wouldn't mind going into that a little more.
Sure. So I think that sort of, as Dan and I talked a little bit about, I think that Judge Gorsuch is going to be a consistent vote on the Supreme Court to sort of roll back the protections that women have gotten over the last several decades, or even potentially the last 50 years. And one particular area that I didn't touch on exactly, but I think is important to also mention in the context of women's rights, is women's right to choose whether to have an abortion. And certainly Judge Gorsuch hasn't come out and said whether he supports or would vote to uphold the decision in Roe versus Wade, but we have grave concerns that he would not do that. If you look at his time before joining the federal bench, Judge Gorsuch spent a lot of his writing questioning the constitutional and analytical underpinnings of the Roe decision, and suggesting that if given the opportunity, he would not read the Constitution to protect a woman's right to choose.
If Judge Gorsuch makes it to the Supreme Court, what would that mean for the LGBTQ community is our next question.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And so I think that there's a couple of different things we can look to sort of give us some insight into how Gorsuch would rule on LGBTQ issues. I think the first thing I would point you to is an article that Judge Gorsuch wrote in 2005 called Liberals and Lawsuits, where he essentially criticized so-called liberals for their use of constitutional litigation in the courts to vindicate their constitutional rights. And in that article, he specifically points to advocates for same-sex marriage rights under the Constitution as examples of individuals who he thinks have inappropriately used the courts to try and vindicate constitutional rights. Judge Gorsuch has since said he wished that he hadn't written that article, but it's clear from reading his cases and his sort of jurisprudence that he takes a very narrow reading of the Due Process Clause and various other portions of the Constitution that we typically think about as being protective of LGBTQ people. So we have grave concerns that he would work to sort of pull back constitutional rights won by LGBTQ people, or certainly when new issues come before the court, that he would not interpret the Constitution to protect the full rights of LGBTQ Americans.
I'm gonna add one point to that. The Hobby Lobby case that he decided on the 10th Circuit that the Supreme Court eventually upheld has caused great damage to LGBT individuals throughout the country. Many corporations have taken that case as a license to discriminate against LGBT Americans in the workforce. So I think it's quite clear based on his record, based on the fact that he criticized individuals seeking the right to marry for using the courts, that he would cause enormous damage if he's able to join the court.
Next question, what is Judge Gorsuch's record on workers' rights and union issues?
Great question. It's terrible. That's the simple one-word answer. Quite frankly, there's a series of cases where, under the law, the courts are supposed to defer to the Department of Labor, to OSHA, to the NLRB in protecting workers' rights. In a series of cases, Judge Gorsuch second-guessed those agencies. In almost every instance, those agencies have come down on the side of wage rights for workers, safety rights for workers, anti-discrimination rights for workers. He has repeatedly discarded the views of the agencies that are supposed to protect workers in our system. What's telling is in a few instances where the Department of Labor, NLRB, ruled against unions, ruled against workers, Neil Gorsuch went out of his way to talk about how important it was to defer to them. What's clear is he's a results-oriented judge who's ideologically driven to repeatedly side against workers and against unions.
A questioner asks, do you believe with this nomination that Roe is at risk of being overturned?
Yes, I do. I think it's, as I sort of mentioned before, Judge Gorsuch hasn't said whether he would vote to uphold the constitutional underpinnings of Roe, but I encourage you to look through the report that provides ample evidence that from a very early time in his career, before he ever joined the federal bench, Judge Gorsuch took an approach to Roe, and then the case that came after Roe, which was Casey and reaffirmed the right in Roe, has taken a very skeptical view of those cases. And I think if given the opportunity, Judge Gorsuch would likely vote to constrict the rights provided, the right under the Constitution for women to choose whether to have an abortion. So I think it's probably likely.
The only thing I'll add is President Trump made it abundantly clear, both as a candidate and as a president, that he is committed to putting a person on the Supreme Court who will overturn Roe v. Wade. I take the president at his word that he knows Neil Gorsuch's record in this area, and that Neil Gorsuch is committed to overturning critical rights for women.
Judge Gorsuch appears to have a very poor record on the rights of children with disabilities. Can you talk a little more about that?
Sure. Well, I think there's more than one case, if you read the report, that suggests that Judge Gorsuch his record is extremely poor on the rights of students with disabilities. One particular example that I'll use, and then I'll let Dan maybe talk about another. There was an instance of a student who had autism and various other physical and mental disabilities, and was being treated extremely poorly at school, was being physically abused, was being placed into a room, locked into a room, a timeout room, for long periods of time. Those actions caused the student to have severe anxiety. His physical health declined. And when that case came before the 10th Circuit and the family was seeking to vindicate their constitutional rights, Judge Gorsuch said that the actions of the school administrators didn't shock the conscience, that it was acceptable for school administrators to physically abuse and subject the student to confinement in a small room. So that's sort of one example of the kinds of things that Judge Gorsuch is willing to let pass. And then there's a couple of cases under the IDEA, and I think Dan could talk about one of those.
I think your question is a great question, because I think his views on the rights of persons with disabilities really epitomizes how he approaches congressional acts designed to protect the American people, whether it's the IDEA, the Rehabilitation Act, the ADA, anti-discrimination laws. When Congress has gone out of its way to make sure that all Americans have equal opportunities and can enjoy their rights in this country, Neil Gorsuch has taken as narrow a view of the statute as humanly possible and has erected barriers to those individuals enforcing their rights in courts. And I think your question is great, because in the IDEA, the rehabilitation cases, just epitomizes the steps he takes to make sure that these critical statutes are not properly enforced.
I have another question, and I think it's unlikely that this is covered in the current report. In fact, I'm certain the current report focuses on cases, but I want to raise it because a viewer is asking if we know whether Neil Gorsuch has attended judicial retreats sponsored by those with interests in cases before federal courts.
You know what? I think it's a great question because Neil Gorsuch has filed his Senate questionnaire, which we are only now having a chance to seriously review. And it's telling that just 2 days ago, I believe, Neil Gorsuch supplemented his Senate questionnaire with even more information that senators need to examine, including the question of where he spoke, conferences he went to. This is just one reason why the Senate cannot rush this confirmation, that senators need ample time to scrutinize his entire record. And that's not just his record on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. That's his record when he worked in the Bush Justice Department. That's his record as a private citizen. We're talking about an individual who will serve on the Supreme Court potentially for 2 or 3 more decades. He will have an impact on every single American and their rights and legal protections. Your question just epitomizes how important it is that the Senate have time to review everything in his record. Why? And it's imperative the Republicans not rush to rubber stamp this nomination.
Can you talk a little bit about how the judicial confirmation process works?
Yes, the president has made his nomination, but that's only half the process. The other half, the Constitution makes clear that the Senate must provide advice and consent. There will be, Chuck Grassley announced, I believe just yesterday, a confirmation hearing on March 20th, beginning March 20th. It should last several days, where senators will have time to ask Neil Gorsuch questions about his record and his views. They will also bring outside witnesses who can testify to what kind of judge he'll be. And then there's an opportunity for the American people to weigh in. Every senator has a vote, and it's imperative that the senators hear from their constituents that this is not just a question for people in Washington. This is maybe, short of a declaration of war or impeachment, the most important vote that a United States senator will make. It is critical that they hear from their constituents who are going to be affected by how he rules on issues involving women's health, workers' rights, the environment, criminal justice issues, the rights of people with disabilities, and the list goes on and on. It's hard to overstate the amount of damage he can do on the court, which is why it's so important that between now and the time the Senate votes on his confirmation, most likely in April, as many voices are heard.
A couple of commenters have noted the TV commercial campaign that is running now. One person notes, never in my life have I seen a TV commercial for a SCOTUS nominee. That is a little scary. Do you want to weigh in on that?
I think we're very confident. I'm not going to speak to the individual commercial. I'm not sure if everybody's seen it or what commercial is being referenced. But I think we're very confident that once people get to know Neil Gorsuch's record, it'll be clear that he is not somebody who should be on the Supreme Court of the United States. And quite frankly, it's people like Alphonse Madden, who I mentioned earlier. It's one thing to have a commercial from a lawyer here in Washington who might know Neil Gorsuch. It's another thing for the American people to hear about the everyday Americans, a truck driver who are affected by Neil Gorsuch and the harm that he would do to so many Americans. So we're confident that as more and more people begin to focus on his record, the cases where he has gone out of his way to ensure that the American people, American workers, cannot redress their harms in court, that the American people and then the senators will realize he's not the person who should be on the Supreme Court.
What do we know about Judge Gorsuch's views on police shootings and excessive force by police officers?
That's a great question. So I think that we've covered a sort of vast number of cases in Judge Gorsuch's record on criminal justice, and we've touched on some issues of excessive force. as well as various other forms of sort of unconstitutional policing conduct. But I'll say that as a general rule, Judge Gorsuch has been unwilling to hold accountable government officials, in some instances including police officers that have used excessive force against people suspected or accused of committing crime. One good example of that was a case where a young man was approached by police and in an area that was known to grow marijuana. When the man took off running, the police tased him in the head, and he ended up passing away because of that incident. And in that case, Judge Gorsuch said that the police's actions didn't violate the Constitution and did not amount to excessive force, even though the individual posed no threat to the public, would likely have been caught later, and was not suspected of committing any type of crime of violence. So there's sort of numerous examples throughout the record that demonstrate that Judge Gorsuch just, is out of touch with the realities that many people face in their communities, and that when things go wrong, he's not willing to hold accountable individuals who act unconstitutionally.
We're about out of time. We have about 2 minutes remaining, folks, if you'd like to make some closing remarks.
Well, I think we encourage everyone to read this report because I think Neil Gorsuch's record speaks for itself. The question for the U.S. Senate is not whether he has good academic record, because quite frankly he does. It's not whether he has a sterling resume. It's whether he shares the constitutional values and commitment to legal protections that the American people rely on, that are so important to countless Americans throughout the country. And it's clear from this report that in a review of his cases and his views both on and off the bench, that he wants to take the country backwards, that he wants to eviscerate the ability of the federal government to protect clean air, clean water, safe food and medicine, workers' rights, women's rights, the rights of persons with disabilities, and so many other critical legal protections. He is not somebody who should sit on the Supreme Court, and we are very confident that the American people will make sure that their senators know his record and know that he should not be confirmed to the Supreme Court.
Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. That concludes our Facebook Live. Looking forward to seeing you again.